Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a video.
So, the mechanism of salvation, according to Catholics, is that we're saved by grace through faith in works, not works for works. Do you see how stupid that sounds?
Well, any attempt to try to negotiate a single consistent soteriology from the Bible is going to sound strained and forced. But what happens if we set aside the petty and naive sectarianism?
The Mormons do the same thing. In 2 Nephi 25:23, they say we are saved by the grace of God after all we can do.
No, I said set aside the petty and naive sectarianism, not double down on it.
The book of each religion is the contract you're actually signing. And then they come in with the salesman trying to tell you it doesn't say exactly what it does say.
They didn't do anything. This research project and the resulting conference presentation and paper were 100% my sole initiative.
Here's this clown, Dan McClellan. He's trying to sell you on the idea that after all we can do actually means despite all you can do, which literally flips the meaning of the verse.
Well, it flips it from the later secondary reading back to the original reading that was intended by the author or authors and understood by the original audiences. And I can prove this. And that is what my paper, which is entitled 2 Nephi 25:23 in Literary and Rhetorical Context, does. What I did here was go through and look at all the occurrences I could find of after all, and then that is sometimes included, we, he, she, they, it, can do, could do, will do, in order to determine from the context how this phrase was being used. And I found some interesting things. But to start off, let's look at the word after, which in the Oxford English Dictionary is given a sense of in spite of, notwithstanding a preceding event or action. And here you can see that usage starting in the 16th century all the way down to today. And as you can see, many of these uses occur within the prepositional phrase after all. And that phrase all by itself can mean in view of everything or in spite of expectations to the contrary. And we see that latter sense is primarily intended in the construction that we see here, where all is qualified in some way. Now, let's look at an example from the history of the church from 1840 that uses a qualified sense of after all to mean despite all. This is a little hard to read, but the underlined portion says, she refused to go any further with him, upon which he got hold of her by the arm to force her along. But her sister was soon with them, and the two women were too many for him, and he was forced to sneak off without his errand, which is scratched out, and pray is written in, after all his labor and ingenuity. This does not mean that he was forced to sneak off once he was done with all his labor and ingenuity. It means he was forced to sneak off without his prey, despite all his labor and ingenuity. And let's look at a more explicit example from the year before the Book of Mormon was published. This is from William Cobbett's A French Grammar, or Plain Instructions for the Learning of French in a Series of Letters. It's from 1829. In the dictionary, as I observed in paragraph 42, you will find against every noun either SM or SF. The former means substantive or noun masculine, and the latter substantive or noun feminine. And this, after all that grammarians can do, after all the rules that they can give, is the only sure way of learning from books the gender of the French nouns. So this cannot possibly mean that once grammarians have done all they can do, once they have given all the rules that they can give, this becomes the only sure way of learning from books the gender of the French nouns. It indisputably means that despite all that grammarians can do and all the rules they can give, memorization is the only sure way of learning from books the gender of the French nouns. But it gets even more interesting because we see this phrase used an awful lot in contexts having to do with grace versus works. Here are some examples from the 18th century. This first one is from Thomas Blackwell's Ratio Sacra, or an appeal under the rational world about the reasonableness of revealed religion. And he says, nor can it believe any merit with finite and perfect man, shortcoming and polluted in his most holy things, and owing his all to God, having nothing of his own, and who, after all he can do, is still an unprofitable servant. Here is another example from Samuel Sayer, Essays on the Important Truth Contained in the Holy Scriptures from 1761. Here is another example from Bilby Porteous from 1777, An Earnest Exhortation to the Religious Observance of Good Friday. These are all appealing to the notion of the unprofitable servant from Luke 17:10. which reads in the King James Version, "So likewise ye, when ye shall have done all those things which are commanded you, say we are unprofitable servants, we have done that which was our duty to do." We have a reflection of the same idea in Mosiah 2:21, where it says, "If ye should serve him with all your whole souls, yet ye would be unprofitable servants." So let's go look at the memoirs of David Brainerd, who was someone who preached to indigenous peoples in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These memoirs were published in 1822. And he talks about how the Quakers were there doing some preaching of their own, and many of the indigenous folks were swayed by the Quakers, but he talks about one woman who was an exception. She answered in broken English, me try save myself. Last my strength be all gone," meaning her ability to save herself. "Could not me stir a bit further. Den last me forced let Jesus Christ alone send me hell if he please. I said, but you was not willing to go to hell, was you?" She replied, "Could not me help it. My heart, he would wicked for all. Could not me make him good." Meaning she saw it was right she should go to hell because her heart was wicked and would be so after all she could do to mend it, which very clearly, again, means despite all she could do to mend it. Let's look at John Hershey's 1831, The Importance of Small Things publication, where he says, "But your own wisdom and greatness must be laid in the grave. It is, after all you can do, the free and unmerited gift of God. It does not become a free and unmerited gift of God only after you have done all you can do. It is despite all you can do. The free and unmerited gift of God." 1834, we have the Evangelical Magazine, an anonymous paper entitled Practical Tendency of the Doctrines of Grace, and it talks about how our works are altogether inadequate to the production of holy affections, and then we start on the top half here. "The reason is they have no desire for that in which holiness consists. The fountain still remains corrupt, and after all they can do, or despite all they can do, without this divine influence on the heart, they remain utterly unprepared for the kingdom of heaven." Now, a lot of this is responding to the rise of Enlightenment rationalism, natural religion, and deism. And in the 18th century, we see a lot of pushing back against this. So here is a text from 1797 that is taking aim at T. Paine's Age of Reason, and this is by Thomas Scott. It is called A Vindication of the Divine Inspiration of the Holy Scriptures and of the Doctrines Contained in Them, being an answer to the two parts of Mr. T. Paine's Age of Reason. And he says, "I fear numbers will side with the infidels, after all believers can do," which also very clearly means despite all believers can do. "After all we can do" was used in the 18th and 19th centuries to very clearly mean despite all we can do. It was used in debates about grace versus works. That's exactly how the Book of Mormon picks it up. If you look throughout the Book of Mormon's discussions about grace, you will see that once you enter into the gate and become reconciled by God, grace is what saves the person despite all they can do.
But on Judgment Day, when you repeat that salesman platitude, the devil will
Not interested.